First class was a sanctuary of chilled champagne and hushed whispers, slicing through the stratosphere. But a storm was boarding, a man with fists like hammers and a toxic ego, walking straight towards the one passenger you should never, ever provoke. The hum of the engines was a low, steady mantra at 35,000 feet. In seat 3A of the first-class cabin, Jason Statham, age 55, looked every bit the man from his movies, yet softer around the edges, more real. Dressed in a tailored Brunello Cucinelli travel blazer over a simple gray t-shirt, he was a study in controlled energy. His gaze, famously intense on screen, was turned towards the clouds, a tumbler of amber single malt whiskey resting lightly in his hand. He was en route from Los Angeles to Tokyo, not for a film shoot, but as a guest of honor at a charity boxing night, an event raising funds for underprivileged youth. For him, this flight was a rare pocket of anonymity, a moment to decompress before the flashbulbs and handshakes. But peace is a fragile commodity. The disturbance began as a sound, heavy, arrogant footsteps stomping down the aisle, followed by a voice that grated like gravel in a blender. "I don't care what your tablet says. I paid for a premium ticket, and I'm not getting stuck next to some snoring oaf in premium economy." A man appeared at the curtain separating the cabins. He was young, maybe late 20s, with the kind of sculpted gym body and aggressively expensive streetwear that screamed new money. A gaudy Balenciaga jacket hung off his shoulders, and a ridiculously oversized gold watch clung to his wrist. This was Kyler, the flight attendant, a model of professional calm. Tried to reason with him. "Sir, first class is fully booked. There are no available seats." Kyler's eyes scanned the cabin, dismissing the flight attendant as if she were furniture. They landed on an empty seat next to Statham. "What about that one?" he demanded, pointing. "It's empty. I'm taking it." Statham didn't turn. He simply took a slow sip of his whiskey, the ice clinking softly. He'd dealt with men like Kyler his entire life. Bullies who mistook wealth for worth and noise for power. "Sir, that seat is reserved for crew rest on long-haul flights," the attendant explained, her voice tightening. It was no use. Kyler stormed past her, yanking his designer duffel bag from his shoulder and shoving it into the overhead bin directly above Statham with a loud thud. He loomed over the seat. "Move your stuff," he grunted, gesturing at the small leather-bound book Statham had placed on the empty seat. Statham finally turned his head, his eyes meeting Kyler's. There was no anger in his gaze, just a flat, cold assessment. "You're in the wrong section, mate." A smirk played on Kyler's lips. He leaned down, invading Statham's space, his voice a low, mocking drawl. "And you're my way, old-timer. Now be a good chap and move." He punctuated the sentence by deliberately knocking Statham's arm. The whiskey sloshed, a wave of amber liquid splashing over Statham's hand and onto the pristine cream leather of the seat. That was the first mistake. Statham set the glass down with unnerving precision. He didn't wipe his hand. He just watched Kyler. The flight attendant rushed over. "Sir, I'm going to have to insist." Kyler ignored her and made his second mistake. He reached out and shoved Statham's shoulder. "Did you hear me? I said." He never finished the sentence. In a motion too quick to follow, Statham's hand shot up and clamped around Kyler's wrist. It wasn't a slap or a hit. It was a seizure, his fingers digging into the pressure points with the efficiency of a surgeon. Kyler's eyes widened in shock, a gasp escaping his lips as a jolt of pure, unadulterated pain shot up his arm. "What the—" "I heard you," Statham said, his voice a low rumble. "Now you have two choices. You can walk back to your assigned seat, or I can escort you. I guarantee you won't like the escort." He tightened his grip, and Kyler let out a choked groan. For a moment, the man's arrogance fractured, replaced by a flicker of fear. He snatched his wrist back, cradling it. But the humiliation was too much for his ego to bear. His face twisted into a mask of rage. "You'll regret that," he hissed, backing away. "You have no idea who I am." He then made his third and worst mistake. He swung a wild, telegraphed right hook aimed straight for Statham's face. It was like watching a child throw a rock at a tank. The punch never landed. Statham didn't duck or weave. He simply shifted his weight, letting the fist sail harmlessly past his ear. In the same fluid motion, his other hand came up, not to block but to guide. He caught Kyler's outstretched arm, using the man's own momentum to spin him around and slam him face first into the bulkhead. The sound was a sickening, hollow thud that echoed through the silent cabin. Kyler crumpled to the floor, dazed and groaning, a trickle of blood starting from his nose. The entire exchange took less than 3 seconds. The flight attendant gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. A few passengers, who had been pretending not to watch, were now staring openly, their phones half raised. Statham stood up, calmly straightened his blazer, and looked down at the heap on the floor. "Stay down," he advised, his tone devoid of emotion. He then turned to the stunned flight attendant. "He'll be fine. Might need some ice." But Kyler's humiliation was now a blazing inferno. He scrambled back to his feet, wiping the blood from his lip with the back of his hand. "You're dead," he spat, his voice trembling with fury. "You are so dead." He retreated back through the curtain, his threat hanging in the air. Statham sat back down as if nothing had happened. The woman across the aisle leaned forward, her eyes wide. "That was incredible." He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. Some people don't learn with words. But he knew it wasn't over. Men like Kyler traveled in packs. 5 minutes later, his prediction came true. The curtains swished open again. Kyler was back, and this time, he wasn't alone. Flanking him were 2 other men, both dressed in similar expensive, yet thuggish, attire. They moved with a synchronized arrogance, a silent, understanding passing between them. One was tall and lean with cold, dead eyes. The other was built like a refrigerator, cracking his knuckles with a menacing rhythm. Statham noticed it immediately. All 3 men wore an identical, distinctive ring on their right pinky finger, a heavy, platinum band fashioned into a stylized phoenix rising from flames. This wasn't a random group of entitled bullies. This was a uniform. The cabin's atmosphere shifted from tense to suffocating. The air crackled. The leader of the trio, the refrigerator-shaped one, pointed a thick finger at Statham. "You made a big mistake putting your hands on our associate." Statham rose slowly to his feet, his body relaxed but ready. He scanned them in a single, sweeping glance. His mind, a finely tuned machine from years of professional discipline, processed the data in an instant. Tall one is overconfident, leads with his right, poor footwork. Kyler is all ego, no skill, already beaten. The big one is the anchor, slow but powerful, likely the real threat. He looked past them, his expression unreadable. "Looks like you brought the whole board meeting," he said, his voice laced with his signature dry, British wit. "Pity the agenda's about to be cancelled." The big man's face hardened. The insult, delivered with such casual contempt, was the spark that lit the fuse. The pack gathered. The storm was about to break. The air in the first-class cabin grew thick, heavy with the promise of violence. The 3 men spread out, blocking the aisle, their postures shifting from arrogant posturing to predatory intent. They were a wolf pack, closing in for the kill, certain of their superiority in numbers. They saw one man, past his prime, outnumbered. They didn't see the lion. The tall, lean one lunged first, just as Statham had predicted. He threw a fast, sloppy jab, aiming to overwhelm with speed. It was a street fighter's move, all aggression and no technique. Statham didn't even bother to block. He swayed his head an inch to the right, the punch whistling past his cheek. As the man's arm overextended, Statham stepped in, closing the distance. Whack! His elbow, a sharpened point of bone, drove directly into the man's floating ribs. The thug let out a sharp, agonized gasp as the air was violently expelled from his lungs. Before he could recover, Statham's legs swept out in a low, powerful arc, kicking the man's supporting ankle from under him. He hit the floor with a heavy, rattling crash, his body folding in on itself as he writhed in pain. One down. The big one, the anchor, watched his companion fall, his expression a mixture of shock and fury. He bellowed and charged forward, arms wide. intending to use his sheer mass to bear Statham down in a clumsy tackle. It was a move of brute force, and against any normal person, it would have worked. But Statham wasn't a normal person. He didn't retreat. He met the charge. Just as the man was about to make contact, Statham dropped his center of gravity, grabbed the front of the man's expensive jacket, and used the man's own forward momentum to pivot. He wasn't stopping the charge. He was redirecting it. With a grunt of effort, he heaved the man sideways. The sound was a deafening crack as the thug's head connected squarely with the reinforced frame of the lavatory door. The door shuddered on its hinges. The man's eyes rolled back in his head, and he slid down the wall like a puppet with its strings cut, landing in an unconscious heap. 2 down. The cabin was frozen. Passengers who had been filming on their phones now held them motionless, their mouths agape. This wasn't a fight. It was a demolition. Only Kyler remained. His face was pale, his bravado completely evaporated, replaced by a raw, primal fear. He stood frozen, his hands half raised in a pathetic gesture of surrender. Okay, man. I get it. I'm sorry, he stammered. I didn't know who you were. Statham took a slow, deliberate step towards him. His eyes were like chips of ice. That's the problem, isn't it? He said, his voice dangerously quiet. You didn't care who I was. You just saw someone you thought you could push around. He was now standing directly in front of the terrified Kyler. He suddenly shot his hand out, not to punch, but to grab a fistful of Kyler's jacket, yanking him forward off balance. With his other hand, he didn't strike. He simply placed his open palm on Kyler's chest. I'm not going to hit you again, Statham said, his voice a low growl. He then drove his knee hard into Kyler's solar plexus. It wasn't a blow meant to break bones, but to steal breath and dignity. Kyler doubled over with a strangled wheeze, his face turning a sickly shade of green. Go back to your seat, Statham commanded, releasing him. Kyler stumbled backward, collapsing into an empty aisle seat, clutching his stomach and gasping for air. And think about what it feels like when someone decides they can take whatever they want from you. Just then, the flight crew, who had been huddled near the galley, rushed forward with zip tie restraints. Mr. Statham, are you all right? The purser asked, her voice trembling. I'm fine, he replied, his gaze fixed on the Phoenix ring on Kyler's hand. He recognized it now from a security briefing years ago. The Phoenix Syndicate, not just thugs. A sophisticated, ruthless white-collar crime organization specializing in high-end smuggling and corporate espionage. This wasn't a tantrum. This was something else entirely. And he knew, with chilling certainty, that the real trouble was only just beginning. A fragile, surreal calm descended upon the first-class cabin. The flight attendants, with a mixture of awe and trepidation, were checking on the moaning and unconscious forms, securing them with restraints. Passengers were whispering excitedly, the adrenaline of what they'd just witnessed overriding their fear. Statham returned to his seat, picking up his fallen book. To an outside observer, he looked perfectly composed, but inside, his mind was racing, replaying the events, analyzing the new data. The Phoenix Syndicate didn't engage in petty brawls on airplanes. They were meticulous, professional. This chaotic, public confrontation was completely out of character for them. It felt staged, a distraction. But for what? His eyes scanned the cabin, not as a passenger, but as a predator sensing a hidden threat. And then he saw him, seated 3 rows ahead, in a seat that had been empty moments before, was a man. He was nondescript, dressed in a simple, dark business suit. No luggage, no drink, no tray table down. He was utterly still, his attention fixed on his phone. But he wasn't texting or reading. Statham could see in the faint reflection on the screen that the man's camera was active, pointed not forward, but angled to watch the aftermath of the fight in the aisle. Statham's blood ran cold. This was the professional, the handler. The man in the suit seemed to feel Statham's gaze. He casually pocketed his phone, stood up, and walked calmly down the aisle. He didn't even glance at Statham. He stopped beside the still gasping Kyler, knelt down as if to check on him, and muttered something into the collar of his shirt. A microphone. It was a subtle, almost invisible movement. This wasn't a passenger. This was the operations commander. Having confirmed his asset was contained, the man stood up and walked towards the back of the plane, vanishing behind the curtain into the economy section. He moved with a quiet efficiency that screamed training. Statham discreetly unbuckled his seatbelt. He knew he couldn't let the man disappear. He stood and made his way towards the lavatories, feigning a need to stretch his legs. The unconscious form of the second thug was still slumped against the door. But the first one, the one with the broken ribs, was gone. A faint smear of blood on the carpet was the only sign he'd ever been there. They were cleaning up their mess. He turned back, his senses on high alert. He scanned the faces of the remaining passengers, and he saw them. Two more men, sitting separately but united by the same unnerving stillness. One in row 5, one in row 7. Both wore jackets that were too bulky for the cabin's temperature, their posture rigid. Their coats bulged unnaturally at their waists. More of them. This wasn't a brawl that got out of hand. This was an infiltration. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, cheerful and oblivious. Ladies and gentlemen, we are now beginning our final descent into Tokyo's Narita International Airport. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Statham walked back to his seat, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying speed. The initial fight was a test, a probe to gauge his reaction. The rest of the team was embedded, waiting. But for what purpose? An extraction? An assassination? He sat down, but didn't buckle his belt. He waited. The seatbelt sign chimed. The plane banged, the city lights of Tokyo sprawling below like a carpet of diamonds. Then happened, as if on a silent cue. The two men in rows 5 and 7 stood up. They moved with a chilling synchronicity, completely ignoring the flight attendant's frantic plea to sit down. One turned and moved swiftly towards the cockpit door. The other turned towards Statham. He reached inside his jacket and pulled out an object that glinted under the cabin lights. It extended with a sharp flick, a carbon fiber tactical baton. He was coming to finish the job. The sight of the weapon sent a fresh wave of panic through the cabin. A woman screamed. The man with the baton wasted no time. He lunged at Statham, swinging the baton in a vicious downward arc aimed directly at his head. He was fast, trained, and lethal. But Statham was faster. He didn't rise from his seat. Instead, he threw himself sideways, the baton whistling through the air where his head had been and smashing into the headrest with a sickening crack. As the attacker recoiled from the missed strike, Statham exploded upwards. He drove the heel of his palm up under the man's chin, a bone-jarring blow that snapped his head back. The man's eyes glazed over. Statham then grabbed the wrist of the hand holding the baton, twisted it with brutal efficiency, and slammed the man's own weapon into his temple. The thug collapsed like a marionette, unconscious before he hit the floor. Simultaneously, the second operative had reached the cockpit door and was fumbling with a device, trying to bypass the electronic lock. Hearing the commotion behind him, he spun around, pulling a wicked-looking combat knife from his jacket. He saw his partner on the ground and Statham rising to face him. His eyes widened in a brief moment of hesitation. It was all the opening Statham needed. He kicked an abandoned carry-on bag across the aisle, sending it sliding directly into the man's legs. The operative stumbled, his balance momentarily compromised. In that split second, Statham closed the distance. He grabbed the man's knife hand, slamming it against the wall until the weapon clattered to the floor. A quick, precise headbutt to the bridge of the nose followed, and the second operative crumpled, joining his partner in unconsciousness. The cockpit door suddenly swung open. The pilot stood there, his face ashen, his hands raised. "Don't! He's got." Behind him, framed in the doorway, was the handler, the man in the suit, and he had the young co-pilot in a brutal headlock. In his hand, he held a jagged shard of glass, a piece from the very whiskey tumbler Kyler had knocked over earlier. He pressed the sharp edge against the co-pilot's throat, drawing a thin line of blood. "That's enough," the handler snarled, his voice calm and cold. "This plane lands where I say, when I say. Or your hero here gets to watch me redecorate the cockpit." Statham stood perfectly still, his hands raised in a placating gesture. He was 10 feet away, too far to rush. "Let him go," he said, his voice level. "Your plan failed. It's over." The handler let out a dry, humorless chuckle. "It's only over when I say it is. You were supposed to be the distraction, Statham. We were extracting a corporate asset from the back of the plane. But you had to play the hero. Now, you're going to be the lesson." He pressed the glass tighter. Statham's eyes never left the handlers, but his focus was absolute. He saw everything. The tension in the man's arm, the co-pilot's terrified eyes, the angle of the glass, and, dangling near the handler's leg, the coiled cable of the co-pilot's spare headset. It was just close enough. "You really want to do this?" Statham asked, taking a half step to his left, a seemingly insignificant shift. "I'm not walking off this plane," the handler sneered. "And neither are you." "Funny," Statham said softly. "I was about to say the same thing." Then he moved. He didn't go forward. He lunged left, a feint that drew the handler's attention for a microsecond. In that instant, Statham's right hand shot out, not at the man, but at the dangling headset cable. He snagged it, yanked it hard, and twisted. The cable wrapped around the handler's ankle, pulling his leg out from under him. He stumbled backward with a cry of surprise, his balance gone. The co-pilot, sensing his chance, dropped and rolled away. The handler's grip on the glass loosened for a fraction of a second. It was all Statham needed. He surged forward, grabbing the back of the man's head with one hand and his arm with the other. He didn't punch him. He used him as a battering ram. He slammed the handler's face into the cockpit's control panel. Once, twice. The sickening crunch of bone and plastic echoed in the tiny space. The handler went limp, sliding to the floor in a bloody, unconscious heap. Statham stood, breathing steadily. He looked at the terrified but unharmed co-pilot scrambling back into his seat. He simply nodded. "Let's get this thing on the ground." 20 minutes later, the plane touched down on the tarmac at Narita International. It didn't taxi to the gate. Instead, it was met by a swarm of flashing blue and red lights. A heavily armed airport police tactical unit, clad in black, stormed the plane before the engines had even fully spooled down. Jason Statham stood calmly at the front of the cabin, arms folded, watching as the 5 unconscious or semi-conscious members of the Phoenix Syndicate were cuffed and dragged out. Kyler, now sobbing with a mixture of pain and terror, was the last to go. A senior Japanese police official, his face grim, approached Statham. "Mr. Statham," he said, bowing deeply. "We received intel about a possible extraction on this flight, but we had no idea it would escalate to this. We cannot thank you enough." Statham just shrugged. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. The officer glanced at the trail of destruction down the aisle. "I believe, sir, that they discovered they were on the wrong plane." Within an hour, the story exploded. It was the lead item on every news network worldwide. Jason Statham thwarts mid-air hijacking. Action star in real-life action movie at 35,000 feet. The blurry, shaky phone footage shot by passengers went viral, racking up millions of views. Pundits and security experts analyzed the clips, marveling at his efficiency and control. Back in his penthouse suite at the Park Hyatt Tokyo, Statham finally allowed himself a moment of peace. He poured a cup of green tea, the steam warming his bruised knuckles, and looked out at the glittering expanse of the city skyline. On the television, a news report was detailing the fallout. The failed operation on the flight had exposed a key cell of the Phoenix Syndicate. Acting on information from the arrested handler, international authorities had launched coordinated raids in 3 different countries. A massive smuggling ring had been dismantled. A human trafficking operation was uncovered. The dominoes were falling, all because one man on one flight refused to be pushed around. One person's courage can have an unimaginable ripple effect. Do you think stepping up in a situation like that is a responsibility or a choice? Share your thoughts in the comments and comment respect. If this story got your heart racing, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true tales of heroism.